Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and today I am joined by Alex. And Alex, tell the group a little bit about yourself. And I've asked Alex to give me some interviews as we lead up to the Global Summit. It's always better to have somebody interview and have a dialogue versus, talking to the microphone. And Alex was kind enough to volunteer to help me with the last Supply Chain Insights Global Summit. And I love Alex because he's a younger, more energized person in supply chain. So Alex, tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am definitely newer to the supply chain industry. I'm a Gen Y. My name is Alex Wisniewski, and I work with Digital PMO Group, helping companies with digital supply chain transformations. And I help Lora from the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit lens, specifically around some of the social media, and now as we lead up to the conference, some of the podcasts and kind of content creation that we can do virtually. So really happy to work with her, and I'm really looking forward to the conference the summit, as we plan that here for September. Awesome.
Well, Alex, it's great to have you interview me because it's interesting. I've got kind of a baby boomer's view of the world, and, you're, significantly younger. We won't count the years. And tell me a little bit about your thoughts about reading some of my recent blog posts. I think we're going to do supply chains, change or tradition, face the whip, and we're seeing a big bullwhip effect.
We are, yeah. And it's a great preface to our conversation today, Lora, because the ones that are changed to tradition are some of the leaders that have helped develop the industry, develop the terminology, the tools and whatnot. And as a younger person stepping into the industry, obviously curiosity is a big capability that I like to bring to whatever role I step into, and consistently asking why they do that, how they do that. The answers aren't as fleshed out as we think they are. And I think your article clearly outlined that. Leaders don't understand some of the places that they've put themselves into and maybe how to get out of them.
So true. That's so true. So who do you have in mind when you reference that? Did any company come to mind when you were reading that, or any practice come to mind? I love the simplicity of the toilet paper example. Mm-hmm. And I think that I don't want to rehash, any old COVID explanations, but the simplicity of the raw materials and then the delivery of the product and the supply chain. There's no individual company, but that service, that product is one that I like to use to frame whatever I'm talking about. And one I find that if I'm talking to an expert that may or may not truly understand the industry, one that someone can also understand too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The fact that we tried to stuff 22% more product through the same retail doors and didn't redesign the supply chain to go directly to the retail stores is still something that befuddles me, or the fact that I faced the shelf with a Procter & Gamble buy one, get one free for Charmin when no toilet paper was on the shelf. And, it's like we didn't change our practices, even though people use toilet paper where they are, and we knew that people were at home, and we didn't adjust the forecast, and we were always on the back foot. Lots of lessons to be learned from the toilet paper issues.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it made me think, Laura, because you just kind of hit on something there, right? You're shopping for toilet paper. There's no toilet paper on the aisle, but yet there's a promotion running for a 2-for-1 special.
Right.
This leads me to the first question. Supply chain leaders need to understand not only the end-to-end of the supply chain, or what we consider end-to-ends of supply chain, which is a pretty ominous term anyways, right? Depending on the organization and how well it's defined, as we've learned, which is it's one of the more complex parts of the business. It's not really clearly defined, but in your article, you also ask them, or you say we're also asking supply chain leaders to understand three things: shortages, economics, and business continuity on top of the supply chain end-to-end processes that are kind of underlying a company. How do you coach supply chain leaders to think about the complexity of a supply chain?
Well, I think it starts with defining the supply chain. And there's an article that I like to reference called Paperclip Yourself to an Order, which was a Harvard Business Week article, which I use a lot as an analogy. And I say, clip yourself to an order in your supply chain and just map out for yourself what that looks like and be different products, right? Because we don't have one supply chain, we have multiple supply chains, and draw it, right? I think so many times we're into the numbers, but we don't really draw the flows. And then look at the consternation or the lack of clarity of process as you're going through the system and ask yourself, how do you drive improvement? So many people talk about supply chain in abstract terms, but they really don't understand the flows, the rhythms and cycles of the flows. I also like to measure the coefficient of variation of the flows to be able to look at variability of demand and to be able to look at the Bullwhip effect as you compare the coefficient of variation of orders to the coefficient of variation of planned orders to the coefficient of variation of procured materials. And when you do that, you can start to see, just the distortion issues.
You talked about the bullwhip effect. Our supply chain leaders, I think, are pretty familiar with some of these terms and some of these, the terminologies that have been used to describe supply, demand, the variation of it. Do you see that the younger supply chain professionals coming into this space have that same understanding, or are they challenging the paradigms and in a good or bad way?
So the bullwhip effect is well understood from the game, the beer game. And I think most people play the beer game. Did you play the beer game? I'm not talking about the one you might have had at the frat house. I'm talking about the one you might have had in supply chain class.
I was a game theory major, or I took some game theory classes and also came across the beer game. Yeah.
Okay. So play the beer game and it becomes pretty clear what the bullwhip effect is. However, we don't stop and say, what 3 steps do we take to eliminate the bullwhip effect, right? We talk about how awful it is and how it would have been great if, we had a better signal, but we don't stop and say, what 3 things do I need to do in my supply chain to not play the beer game every day? And the biggest thing is coupling yourself to an order. Sure. So as long as your supply chain is heavily tethered to the order as a proxy of demand, you will whip that supply chain because demand latency is a killer. Demand latency is the time it takes from consumption to the order. The second issue, after you understand that order is a bad proxy for demand and tethering yourself to the order will amplify the bullwhip effect, the second thing you've got to really focus on is process latency of how long does it take you to make a decision and how do you streamline that decision making. And then the third thing is really how do you fight complexity, because complexity will elongate the tail, and whether it's products or platforms or grades, the more complexity you have in your product portfolio, the bigger your bullwhip effect will be.
Interesting. Okay. That makes sense. So is there any challenging in the mental models that you see of professionals or supply chain professionals, kind of alluding to that last question that I have? While the bullwhip effect, and I think the beers game is a great analogy for the bullwhip effect, are supply chain professionals or younger supply chain professionals, to the point in your article, are they encouraging people to think of and using new proxies, consumption, or maybe a multimodal variable instead of an old proxy like demand?
No.
Or the order? No, there's no challenge.
No, and in fact, many times people will come up with better ways to use order data and call it demand driven. So like DDMRP is very reliant on order data, which is amplifying the bullwhip effect. And even though they're using better math to calculate the buffers, they're not really looking at consumption data and the offset lead time of latency. Most people don't really think about how long it takes to develop an order off of consumption data.
What's that latency that you typically see? What should people shoot for?
Well, it varies. So I used to run a warehouse. I used to run a warehouse for Clorox, and we made what we call blue label bleach. So think about, a gallon jug of blue bleach. It has a blue cap on it, right? You probably bought some.
I can smell it right now.
Yeah, the demand latency for that product for my manufacturing plant when I used to work at Clorox from Walmart Lawrence, DC, which was a 3-day order cycle time, was 18 days. So it took 18 days for a shelf replenishment signal to trigger an order based upon normal volume. That's a high volume kind of spin. But then what happened was the marketing folks at Clorox decided that they needed floral bleach and lemon bleach and lime bleach, and that we needed bleach in quarts, not just gallons. And so a quart bleach that had the pink bottle, which was, scented like flowers, would have a demand latency of 90 days, right? Because it was smaller, not as many people ordered it. And so it was 90 days. So the problem was that it was harder for me to get caps and bottles for the smaller items than the bigger items. And so I was always running out of stock. And so when I started to use the Walmart retail consumption data, that allowed me to minimize the bullwhip effect and to see what was happening in consumption, because it was seasonal, very much based upon kids going back to school in certain regions, household cleaning. People would tend to clean their houses in March and April, depending upon the seasons. And so it allowed me to manage the offset lead time. Now, I also did some work with an over-the-counter drug manufacturer, and the offset lead time for demand latency for them was 185 days. So if you think about sinus medicine, when the pollen starts to flow, you want that sinus medicine really quickly. So cutting through that latency is important to be able to drive a responsive supply chain for allergens. When I was working with DuPont for titanium dioxide, their order latency was 220 days off the channel because they were producing titanium dioxide for paint for cars or for homes. And the cycle for that raw material to get into paint was right at 225 days. So you've got to really map it back based upon product flows. And the way you do that is you look at consumption and you ask yourself the question, what will drive a replenishment signal? So the way that you calculate the order latency is you look at each stage of the supply chain and what triggers the next step of replenishment and what is the normal flow. So you take the consumption data and you say, when will that consumption data trigger a warehouse withdrawal signal? And when will that warehouse withdrawal signal trigger an upstream order? And when will that upstream order trigger an order to the trading partner? And you map that back based upon flow. And that will tell you your demand latency. And every order carries latency. So something like an e-commerce order will have a 1-day latency, but something that is in the industrial sector will have 100 to 200 days of latency.
That's interesting. And when you do map, you map out that product flow, Lora, is there, and this might be a tough question to answer, is there a general buffer that you like to give for latency of a product flow outside of what might be the constraint or the, assuming nothing goes wrong? Is there any, any? No. Okay. That's
no. It's just, you're really looking at order latency and order latency variation to really look at your buffers. But most people don't know the order latency. The concept of order latency is foreign to them. And so the irony is we play the beer game. Everybody's like getting with the program. They're going to whip the bullwhip effect, and then they go back to the home office and they hug the order, right? And I'm like, the order drives the latency. An order drives the bullwhip effect, right? Just chain yourself to be whipped every day. And the higher the variability and the higher the shortages, the bigger and more powerful the whip.
Yeah, interesting. And one thing that you mentioned to kind of cut through that variation or cut through the complexity in your article is, and it's never the end all be all solution, right? But it's can newer forms of technology, you ask, can newer forms of technology help? And this was one of my favorite parts of the article. You mentioned Peter, and you and I both know Peter, but Peter Bolstorff, he's the executive vice president for ASCM, and he argues that companies have only deployed 30% of what they've bought. And he thinks that because companies have implemented what he calls shelfware. Mm-hmm. I love that term. How do you see newer forms of technology helping? You say yes, but how?
Yeah, so Peter and I argue because I'm like, more SAP, APO, or IBP doesn't help us, right? Lots of companies have bought extended suites with SAP or Oracle or Infor, but they aren't necessarily designed for what we need to have happen. So when we're working on a market-driven demand management project, we're looking at multiple variables. And a market-driven demand signal will have 25 to 40 inputs. When I built these for an agri-sciences company, we used 31 inputs. And those inputs will change over time based upon the market. The relative importance of those inputs will change over time, which is a very different model than the conventional model of putting orders and shipments into a demand engine and pushing out a time phase forecast. Now, a market-driven forecast will also tell you baseline demand or market potential, and will tell you if you're shifting demand or shaping demand. We will amplify the bullwhip effect by shaping demand that's really shifting demand. So shifting demand is moving demand period to period, whereas shaping demand is increasing baseline lift. If you increase the complexity of the channel and you shift more demand, you will increase the bullwhip effect. And in times of high variability, when people are trying to grow and the market's changing, often they will shift demand, not shape demand. Shifting demand increases costs, whereas shaping demand increases baseline lift. Does that make sense?
It does. And I love that shift versus shape. I think that's a really, really helpful way to think about demand, the bullwhip effect, and really the complexity required to have the proper orchestration across your supply chain. Or is that fair to say?
Well, the problem is that most people don't measure demand shaping. So average trade promotions, 50% are measured. It takes 6 weeks to measure the effectiveness, even though you're only looking at 50%. So that's not quick enough. So to be able to change this, you've got to be able to admit that what we have today in CRM, trade promotion, price management, demand management is largely legacy. And that if we go outside in and we look at shaping versus shifting and the use of consumption data and the redefinition of these models, you have to build a demand visibility signal across marketing, price management, trade promotion management, rebate management, demand planning, which allows the translation of demand by role and allows people to align on baseline demand.
And kind of your answer right there, I think highlighted the importance of a few things. One, the importance of redesigning work, and two, the importance of having a foundational master data layer to make sure that whatever new processes you implement and that's kind of my next question is, how should organizations think of redesigning work? They need the foundational data layer too. So thinking of that as a precursor, how should organizations think of redesigning work? Who should be included in that brainstorming, that solution that's needed to democratize planning?
Well, first of all, you've got to test the concepts and you've got to answer the question of what should be the planning role in an organization. I believe that the planner becomes much more like a conductor in the orchestra and less about interpreting data. I think the planning organization, when we designed planning in the 1980s, was to be one or two people. And somehow we got 300 to 500 people. And I have organizations that have 21 different titles of planners. And I'm like, how did we get this organization? To me, they're like typing pools back before we put computers on everybody's desk. So if we have collaborative workflow and the ability for what-if analysis by role, and we could redesign planning, I think we've got to ask ourselves, what is the role of the planner? And I think the role of the planner becomes more like the master conductor of looking at demand variability, looking at inflation, looking at, the effectiveness of planning. Do I have a good plan? Do I have a feasible plan? Very different than what you have today, where most people don't test to say, do they have a good plan? And most people don't have a feasible plan. I actually worked with one of your customers who had very negative forecast value add. And I said, if you have such a bad forecast value add and you're making the demand plan so much worse, why don't you turn off demand planning? And they're like, oh, we can't turn it off because it is the single thread that threads between us. And I'm like, even though it's bad data, right? Yes. And so people consciously tether to bad data because it aligns the organization. And that's never the concept of what we had originally planning to be.
So it sounds like as they think about, or as organizations think about what the role of planning should be, regardless of what that role is, they really need to think of this as from a digital transformation standpoint, moving this role or this person from an interpreter of the plan or a plan developer to a consensus orchestrator.
Well, it's sort of like the planner became the sheriff, right? Of this is the plan. And versus, to me, the plans need to be distributed. We need to democratize planning, put planning on everybody's desk to allow them to do what-if analysis and have collaborative planning. Now, this was not possible in the analytics in the 1990s, but it is possible today with newer forms of analytics. And so it's an opportunity for us to rethink planning and to democratize the process.
It is, and it reminds me a little bit about the transformation I think some organizations are going through right now, which is bringing data scientists along the journey with their business teams or their associates, and really instilling some of that business or that data science expertise within the business functions, as opposed to relying on the data scientists or the subject matter experts there. You have to groom them to understand, to interpret that data. It sounds like we need to do something similar with planning and kind of with the democratization of planning there.
Yeah. And, the data scientists, I think, are all good people, but we ask them to paint in the box, not to redefine the boxes, right? So anyway, I hope that helps. Did you like the article?
I did. And it really, I continue to say it, but it made me really excited for how, we need to redefine the architectures of the supply chain processes, but we really also need to redesign work. And I know that's the primary goal of the Imagine conference coming up. So Laura, why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how those two intersect, or where, if there's any session that's really going to be talking about redesigning work or the effect of the bullwhip.
Yeah. So, there is no one company I can just turn to and say, do it like this. Instead, what I have are companies that are testing different concepts. So I have a company that's working on the mining of unstructured data to answer the question of customer service, of when did they know, what did they know, how long did it take them to get back to a customer. And that may sound trivial, but Alex, I've spent 6 to 8 weeks at a customer and they have no idea their customer service level, and they're not mining their customer service data, which is just a very great asset that, we need to mine the email and the unstructured text from customers to be able to look at how are we doing. That's number one. Second is we need a unifying data model across planning. DRP and transportation have nothing in common. There is nothing that gives us a procurement buy plan. And so a unified data model would allow us to rationalize the differences between the models. And I have a contract manufacturer that's going to talk about how a unified data model helps them to drive bidirectional orchestration. And bidirectional orchestration is a concept that can only happen when we design the supply chain for it and we build the planning master data layer. So we're going to be talking about some case studies of both baseline demand and bidirectional orchestration that help people to start on the way. So we don't have all the answers, but I'm hoping that some of these pilots and some of these business leaders are taking first steps to look at new forms of analytics and redefine the taxonomies can help others to take big steps.
Help them redefine them in their own terms, that's for sure.
Right. Yep. So that's it, Alex. I'm looking forward to it too. I look forward to seeing you in Washington. That'll be in September 6th through the 8th. I can't wait. So I'll see you then.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Laura. Have a great one.
Okay. Until next time. Thank you, Alex.